The outlaw gang that robbed the wrong train. Intro: The Train in the Dark. There are some stories from the American West that sound almost too perfect to be true. A steam locomotive cutting through the darkness, a lonely stretch of Wyoming, a group of armed men waiting beside the railroad tracks, dynamite, a safe full of money, and an explosion so powerful that it nearly tore an entire train car apart. But what makes this story interesting to me isn't simply that a train was robbed. Train robberies happened all over the American West. What makes this one different is what happened after the explosion. Because the men who carried out this robbery thought they had just pulled off another successful job. They thought they had beaten the railroad. They thought they had beaten the law. And for a few hours, they were probably right. But they had just committed a robbery that would bring the full attention of one of the most powerful railroad companies in America. And soon, men would be riding across Wyoming looking for them. Detectives would be following their trail. Rewards would be placed on their heads, and the legendary Wild Bunch would discover that one successful robbery could make them much more famous than they ever wanted to be. This is the story of the Wilcox train robbery. And honestly, if I had been standing beside those railroad tracks that night, I don't think I would have been thinking about the money. I would have been thinking about one thing. How do you disappear after blowing up a train in the middle of nowhere? Because on June 2nd, 1899, 6 men were about to find out. Chapter 1. Wyoming, 1899. To understand why this robbery happened, we need to understand the world these men were living in. This was Wyoming at the end of the 19th century. The railroad had transformed the American West. Places that once took days or weeks to reach could now be connected by steel tracks. Goods moved across the country. Mail moved across the country. People moved across the country. And most importantly for men like the Wild Bunch, money moved across the country. The railroad wasn't just transportation, it was a moving vault. Every night, trains crossed enormous stretches of wilderness carrying cash, banknotes, valuables, and other shipments. And in many places, there wasn't much around them. No city, no police station, no telephone, no army. Just darkness, mountains, grassland, and miles of railroad. For an outlaw, this was an opportunity. But the railroad companies weren't stupid. They knew exactly what was happening. Companies like Union Pacific and Wells Fargo had already developed increasingly sophisticated security systems. Armed messengers protected valuable shipments. Special agents investigated robberies. Rewards were offered for information. And after a robbery, detectives could coordinate with local law enforcement and organize posses. But in 1899, communication was still slow compared with what we have today. And that meant that if you planned the robbery correctly, you could have a very small window of time when nobody knew what had happened. That was the advantage. Hit the train, take the money, disappear before anyone could react. Simple. At least, that's how it looked on paper. Chapter 2. The Wild Bunch. The men behind this robbery were associated with one of the most notorious outlaw groups of the American West. They were known as the Wild Bunch. Some historians also refer to them as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, although the names and membership weren't always as simple as popular culture later made them seem. Among the men associated with the group were Harry Longabore, better known as the Sundance Kid, Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry, Ben Kilpatrick, Will Carver, and George Leroy Parker, the man the world would eventually remember as Butch Cassidy. Cassidy was not simply some reckless gunman wandering around the desert. That's one of the things I find interesting about him. He had a reputation for being intelligent. He planned robberies. He built relationships. He knew how to organize men. And he understood something very important. A successful outlaw didn't just need courage, he needed logistics. Horses, food, weapons, information, safe places to hide, and, most importantly, a way out. That's what made the Wild Bunch dangerous. They weren't simply looking for trouble, they were looking for opportunities. And a Union Pacific train carrying money through Wyoming, that was one hell of an opportunity. Chapter 3. The Plan. The exact details of who planned every part of the Wilcox robbery are not perfectly known. That's important. Over the years, stories about the Wild Bunch became legends. Newspapers exaggerated events. Witnesses remembered things differently. Later writers repeated stories that had already been repeated many times. So when I tell you what happened next, I'm going to separate the documented events from the parts that historians still debate. What we do know is that shortly before dawn on June 2nd, 1899, Union Pacific's Overland Flyer No. 1 was moving through Wyoming. The train was traveling west. The passengers were probably sleeping. The crew was doing what railroad crews did every night. And somewhere near Wilcox, men were waiting. Imagine that scene for a second. No streetlights, no city skyline, no headlights from cars, nothing like that. Just a steam locomotive moving through darkness. The sound of steel wheels, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic pounding of the train. And somewhere ahead, men with guns were preparing to stop it. I don't know about you, but there's something terrifying about the idea of a train suddenly stopping in the middle of nowhere. The passengers don't know why. The crew doesn't know what's happening. And then, out of the darkness, armed men appear. That's exactly what happened. Chapter 4. Stopping the Train. The outlaws flagged down the train. At least 2 masked men boarded the locomotive and confronted the crew. Their objective wasn't to fight everyone on the train. It was much smarter than that. They wanted control of the engine. The robbers forced the crew to separate the locomotive from the passenger cars. Think about that. They weren't trying to rob every passenger. They didn't need to. The real target was the express car, the car carrying valuables. The locomotive was moved ahead, and now the robbers had created something extremely important: distance. The passenger cars were no longer directly connected to the express operation. The bandits could work without immediately having dozens of passengers interfering. Then the locomotive continued down the track, and somewhere along the line, the rest of the gang was waiting. This was not random. This was planned. And that's where I think the Wild Bunch showed just how dangerous they really were. They didn't need 20 men. They needed a few men who knew exactly what they were doing. Chapter 5. The Express Car. Inside the express car was the man standing between the robbers and the money. His name was Ernest Woodcock. He was the express messenger. And he had a job: protect the shipment. The robbers demanded that he open the express car. Woodcock refused. Now imagine being in his position. You're inside a wooden railroad car in the middle of Wyoming. It's dark outside. You know armed men are standing on the other side of the door. And you know that they have dynamite. What do? Open the door or refuse? Woodcock refused. And that decision changed everything. The robbers weren't going to leave empty-handed. They placed dynamite against the express car, and then they lit it. The explosion ripped through the darkness. The door was blown open. Woodcock was badly stunned, but the safe was still a problem. And this is where the robbery went from dangerous to completely insane. because the outlaws decided to use even more dynamite. Chapter 6. Too much dynamite. The goal was simple. Blow open the safe, take the money, leave. But explosives don't always cooperate with plans, especially when you're trying to blow open a safe inside a railroad car. The robbers placed another charge, and this time they used too much. The explosion was enormous. The express car was practically destroyed. The blast tore through the structure. The sides and roof were damaged, and the safe was finally opened. Now imagine standing there after the explosion. Your ears are ringing. Smoke is everywhere. Wood and metal are scattered around you. The railroad car looks like it has been hit by a cannon. And then, through all of that, the robbers start collecting the money. That image tells you almost everything about the mentality of these men. They had just created an explosion powerful enough to announce their presence for miles, and yet they were still calm enough to stop and gather the cash. According to the PBS American Experience timeline, the robbery netted more than $50,000 in cash, banknotes, and gold. That's an enormous amount of money for 1899, and for a few minutes, the robbery looked like a complete success. But there was one problem. The railroad knew something had happened. Chapter 7. The Escape. Once they had the money, the outlaws didn't stay around. They mounted their horses and disappeared into the Wyoming landscape. This is where the story becomes almost cinematic. A destroyed train, a smoking railroad car, a crew trying to understand what just happened, and somewhere in the darkness, 6 riders moving away from the tracks. They had horses, they had money, they had a head start, and they had Wyoming. For the moment, they had everything they needed. But they had also made one enormous mistake. They had attacked Union Pacific. And Union Pacific had resources. Lots of them. Chapter 8. The Telegraph. As soon as the robbery was discovered, word began moving. Not by telephone, not by radio, by telegraph. The message reached Union Pacific offices. A train had been held up. The express car had been blown open. The safe was gone. The contents were gone. And now the railroad had a problem. They needed to catch the men, fast. Within hours, the response was already being organized. Union Pacific had a specially equipped train known as Number 4. It could carry men, equipment, supplies, and horses. This was an important development, because the railroad wasn't simply sending detectives by horseback from the nearest town. They could move men and horses quickly by rail. Fresh horses meant something very important in a Western pursuit: speed. The outlaws could ride hard, but eventually their horses would get tired. The posse could bring fresh animals directly toward the crime scene, and suddenly the advantage the robbers had enjoyed was shrinking. Chapter 9. The Hunt. This is the part of Old West stories that I think people sometimes underestimate. We imagine a posse simply riding after outlaws, but tracking people across the American West was a difficult science. You were looking for hoofprints, broken branches, campfire remains, discarded objects, tracks crossing rivers, changes in direction, anything that could tell you where a group of men had gone. And the Wild Bunch knew this. That's why they had places like the Hole in the Wall, remote country, difficult terrain, natural hiding places, the perfect environment for men who didn't want to be found. But the railroad had another weapon: money, a lot of it. Immediately after the robbery, enormous rewards were offered. HistoryNet reports that Union Pacific offered $1,000 for each robber, dead or alive. The Pacific Express Company offered the same, and the federal government also offered $1,000 per man. 6 men, 3 separate rewards. Suddenly, the 6 outlaws weren't just criminals, they were walking targets worth thousands of dollars. And that changes the entire equation. Because now, every rancher, cowboy, lawman and informant in the region had a reason to pay attention. Someone might recognize them, someone might see their horses, someone might hear them talking, someone might decide that turning them in was worth the money. The Wild Bunch had escaped the train, but they couldn't escape the entire West. Chapter 10. Butch Cassidy. And this brings us back to Butch Cassidy. Popular culture has made him one of the most recognizable outlaws in American history. Movies turned him into a charming anti-hero. But the real story is more complicated. Cassidy is generally associated with the planning of the Wilcox robbery, but historians caution that there isn't solid evidence proving he personally stood beside the train that night. And honestly, I think that's more interesting. Because it reminds us that these weren't movie characters. They were real people. Their names were real. Their crimes were real. And the historical record is messy. Maybe Cassidy was there. Maybe he wasn't. What we can say with much more confidence is that the robbery was later traced to members of his Wild Bunch. And if Cassidy really was behind the plan, then the robbery demonstrated exactly why he had such a reputation. It was organized, fast, violent, and extremely profitable. But there was something else. The robbery had made the Wild Bunch famous. And fame was probably the last thing an outlaw actually needed. Chapter 11. The New Reality. Before Wilcox, the Wild Bunch could disappear into the landscape. After Wilcox, everyone was looking for them. Newspapers reported the robbery. The railroad wanted revenge. Detectives were working the case. Rewards were circulating. And the image of masked men blowing up a Union Pacific train was exactly the kind of story Americans wanted to read. The Wild West was already changing. Railroads were spreading. Telegraph lines were connecting distant towns. Law enforcement was becoming more organized. Private detectives were becoming more professional. The old frontier was disappearing. And men like Butch Cassidy were becoming relics of a world that was slowly closing around them. The Wild Bunch had been successful, but they had also announced themselves, loudly, with dynamite. Chapter 12. The Price of Success. There's something strange about successful criminals. You would think that getting away with a robbery would make them safer. But sometimes it does the opposite. The bigger the robbery, the bigger the response. The more money you steal, the more people want you caught. And the more famous you become, the harder it becomes to disappear. That's exactly what happened to the Wild Bunch. They continued robbing banks and trains. They continued moving across the West. They continued escaping. But now lawmen were studying them. Pinkerton detectives were gathering information. Railroad officials were improving security. And the pressure was increasing. The Wild Bunch had entered a race, not just against the law, but against time. How long could a group of men continue robbing the most powerful transportation companies in the country before something finally went wrong? Chapter 13. Another Train. And here's the part that almost makes me laugh. Not because it's funny, because it's unbelievable. You would think that after blowing up a Union Pacific Express car and attracting this much attention, the Wild Bunch might decide to stop robbing trains. They didn't. Less than a year later, another Union Pacific train would be robbed near Tipton, Wyoming. Again, dynamite was used. Again, the safe was blown open. Again, the robbers escaped. But this time there was a strange twist. Historical accounts disagree about exactly how much money was stolen. One report claimed the amount was only around $50.40. Other estimates suggested tens of thousands of dollars. Some historians believe the railroad may have had reasons to minimize the reported loss. And that uncertainty is a perfect reminder of what researching the Old West is like. Sometimes the legend is cleaner than the truth. The newspaper says one thing, a lawman says another. A historian finds another document decades later, and somewhere between all of them is what probably happened. Chapter 14. Why the robbery still matters. So why do we still talk about the Wilcox robbery? Because it represents something bigger than one train. It was one of the moments when the old Wild West collided directly with the modern world. The railroad represented the future, fast transportation, mass communication, national commerce, industrial America. The Wild Bunch represented something older, horseback travel, remote hideouts, outlaws, posses, gunfights, and a life where a man could disappear into hundreds of miles of wilderness. But that world was disappearing, and the railroad was helping to destroy it. Ironically, the same railroad the outlaws were robbing was also making it harder for them to remain free. Every new telegraph line made communication faster. Every new railroad station made the territory more connected. Every new detective made it harder to hide. Every new train carried more information and more people. The West was closing, and men like Cassidy knew it. Chapter 15. The End of the Wild Bunch. Eventually, the Wild Bunch could no longer operate as freely as they once had. Some members were killed, others were captured, others disappeared. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid eventually fled the United States. They traveled south. They tried to build new lives. They continued to be involved in crime, and eventually, their story ended in South America. Or at least, that's the accepted version. Even that ending became part of the legend. There have been decades of speculation about what happened to Butch Cassidy. Some people believed he survived. Others believed he died in Bolivia alongside the Sundance Kid. But regardless of what you believe about the final chapter, one thing is certain. The men who once thought they could rob a train and disappear into Wyoming had discovered something that every outlaw eventually learns. Running is easy. Staying free is much harder. And now I want to go back to the title of this story. The Outlaw Gang That Robbed the Wrong Train. Because, technically, they didn't rob the wrong train. They knew exactly what they were doing. They targeted a Union Pacific train. They knew there was an express car. They knew there was a safe. They had a plan. They executed it. And they got away. So why do I call it the wrong train? Because sometimes the mistake isn't choosing the wrong target. Sometimes the mistake is choosing a target that's too big. The Wild Bunch stole tens of thousands of dollars. They blew apart a railroad car. They humiliated Union Pacific. And they walked away believing they had won. But that explosion did something else. It announced their presence. It told the railroad, "We're here." It told the detectives, "Find us." And it told the newspapers, "Write our names down." That robbery helped turn the Wild Bunch from dangerous criminals into legends. And legends are difficult things to live with, because once people know your name, you can't disappear as easily. That's the part of this story that stays with me. Not the money, not even the explosion. It's the image of those 6 men riding away from the wreckage before dawn. They probably believed the hardest part was behind them. They had the money, their horses were waiting, the train was destroyed. Nobody had caught them. Maybe they were laughing. Maybe they were already planning their next robbery. Maybe, for just a few minutes, they felt invincible. But behind them, the telegraph wires were already carrying the news. A train had been robbed. An express car had been blown apart. And 6 men were now worth thousands of dollars each. The chase had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. And that is why I think the Wilcox robbery is one of the most fascinating stories of the American West. Because it wasn't really the story of 6 men who robbed a train. It was the story of 6 men who thought they had escaped, only to discover that the world around them was changing faster than they were. The railroad was getting faster. The law was getting smarter. Communication was getting quicker. And the frontier was getting smaller. The Wild West wasn't disappearing because the outlaws had lost their courage. It was disappearing because there were fewer and fewer places left to hide. And on that cold June morning in 1899, after the smoke cleared from the wrecked express car, the Wild Bunch had taken the money. But they had also taken the first step toward the end of their own freedom. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. They thought they were robbing the railroad, but in the end, the railroad helped bring the entire world down on them. And once that happened, there was nowhere left to ride. The end.